Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Novitska.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Our guest today is Samuel Rowe, the Director of Music at the Basilica of the Assumption in Baltimore, and a recent graduate of the Master's Program in Choral Conducting at Catholic University of America. We discuss things music directors should consider when starting a new job, and a bit about the experience of being a young career professional. These are just some of the topics we'll cover this summer on Monday and Wednesday evenings at St. Joseph's Seminary in a course called Parish Sacred Music Program Management. It meets online June 1st to June 27th from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. and is designed for musicians and clergy from parishes of any size who are searching for inspiration and ideas as they work to expand or make changes to an existing sacred music program. The course presents best practices from model parishes and programs, covering structures, personnel, budget, recruitment, fundraising, materials, and other resources. The seminar aims to provide resources for parishes to consider how they might develop a program which is faithful to the mind and heart of the Church, as well as intimately linked to the nature and structure of the sacred liturgy. To learn more about all the courses we're offering this summer, 2022, please visit www.dunwoody.edu, spelled D-U-N-W-O-O-D-I-E, and click on Dunwoody Music. And now, on to our interview. Some of our listeners are young career professionals or music directors just starting a new job. And so we thought we'd do a show this week on tips and tricks for success for first-time or just starting this job music directors. My guest today is Sam Rowe, himself a relatively new music director, but with enough experience now under his belt to offer just such advice. Sam, could you tell us a little bit about your history in working for the Catholic Church? And of course, I know that for you, this involves a little bit about your history in just becoming a Catholic in the first place.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I do have a bit of a conversion story of sorts. I did grow up in a UCC church, that's the United Church of Christ, in Brunswick, Maine, and didn't come into the Catholic Church until I was in my late teens. When I was going to the UCC church, we did have a really excellent music program there, of which I was a small part as a high school student and middle school student before then. And then I went to study organ at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And in that time, I was an organ scholar at an Episcopal church. And then I held various Protestant church jobs, despite my Catholic faith. I held various Protestant church jobs throughout the North Jersey area, gradually making my way towards Mother Church, starting with a Presbyterian church job, a Methodist church job, and then an Episcopal church job. Then once I went to graduate school at Catholic University of America, I took on a position at St. Mary's in Fredericksburg, Virginia, which is a massive parish. I believe it's the second largest in the in the Diocese of Arlington. And there I was an assisting organist, and so I just played lots of masses. And I was also at the same time I was an assisting organist at the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington D.C., where I just played daily masses on the crypt organ downstairs. And of course, before this time, when I was still in New Jersey, my primary employment as a church musician was working for non-Catholic churches. I did sub around a lot of various Catholic churches, a decent amount of TLM communities I was able to sub at as well. And then after maybe 8 months or so into working in Fredericksburg, I began subbing up at the Baltimore Basilica, where I am now. And then in February of 2020, I took that position on full time.
And what an auspicious month indeed. We'll get to that, I think, in a little bit.
Yes.
More about that particular start date. So what would you describe as some of the most valuable experiences and things you learned in your time at Rutgers and CUA? And what advice might you offer other young professionals about important things for them to learn during their time in school?
Well, I had several really valuable experiences. One of them was actually being an organ scholar at an Episcopal church. I kind of came into college not being the most formed organist. I had a lot of experience as a pianist, specifically as a jazz pianist, but I really, a lot of people enter their undergrad with not a whole lot of organ technique necessarily. And so I really needed a lot of foundation in that area. And so that job was a lot of just kind of dragging myself through Anglican anthems and dragging myself through hymns and a lot of things a lot of important kind of foundational musical things about the job that I just really didn't have a whole lot of formation in. So that was a really good experience, and I definitely would encourage anyone who's an undergraduate, especially, to pursue an organ scholar position. They can be a little thankless, and you don't make a ton of money necessarily, but they are. I mean, I don't know where I would be without that. And of course, my mentor there was the music director at the time. Had a choir school that he was forming that grew to be quite successful. He's since left the position, and so I was also kind of not very much a part of that, but I was able to witness working with kids, which was something that I knew absolutely nothing about as an 18, 19-year-old. So that in particular was a very positive experience. And then I was able to do lots of choral accompanying and choral singing when I was in my undergraduate. I really do think that instrumentalists of any sort really benefit from singing in choirs, but especially organists. I think if you're still in school, you should try and sing every single semester and sing as much as you possibly can. But also just being able to accompany a lot and working with I was able, once I finished at Rutgers, I was a freelancer in the North Jersey area for 3 years, and I was able to accompany lots of choirs and work for lots of different conductors. That was also incredibly beneficial. And then once I got to CUA doing my master's in choral conducting, studying with Tim McDonnell, there I was a lot more. The program that he had built was really structured around working with professional choristers in the DC area. And that was also really beneficial because the way that his program was structured is we had a repertory chorus in addition to the chamber choir that we would sing in, and the university choir that we would occasionally work with as graduate conducting students. But the repertory chorus was a paid group, and they were told, come and sing for these conducting students and do exactly what they do. And so for me, having very little conducting technique before I came to grad school, that was quite a formative experience that I've tried to take with me to my current position now.
And could you talk a little bit more also about your experience in working with the boys' chorus in Newark?
Yeah, so I was the accompanist for the Newark Boys Chorus for 2 years, and that, for those who don't know anything about it, I believe it's the last secular boys choir day school in the country, and it was all boys who also did their academic subjects there at the school. And it was structured very much like, as I understand it, like a St. Paul's Harvard Square and these other institutions, except that it wasn't liturgical, and these boys weren't singing Vespers and Mass daily as they are in some of these other older English cathedral schools, or things based on that model. And so there I taught classroom piano and then was the concert chorus accompanist, which was our touring choir. And that was incredibly informative in a lot of ways, not the least of which was working with all the boys there. They went tuition free, and we had a really tremendous board that was able to raise a lot of money so that the boys didn't have to pay anything in order to go to school there. And then, you're dealing with kids mainly from Newark itself or from the surrounding areas, Essex County, New Jersey. So the Oranges and Linden, Elizabeth, those kinds of towns, for those who are familiar with the area. And very often they were coming from really unfortunate public schools in the area. And they didn't, we actually, my second year there, we extended the education to be, it initially was a 4th grade through 8th grade, and then we ended up extending it to 3rd grade just because we got so many boys in 4th grade whose reading level was really, really low. And so we started getting them younger so that we could have more time to work with them. But while I was mainly teaching music, I was also really involved with chaperoning and kind of walking with these boys as they grew up, oftentimes in circumstances about which I knew next to nothing, which was kind of really formative for me, just understanding, because I think you can tie a lot of that into church music, because the job is to do music, but then there's oftentimes there are these other elements that we don't necessarily expect, like working with kids, and oftentimes working with kids that don't come from the best of circumstances, and you're not just a conductor to them necessarily.
Right.
Yeah.
Where would you say that you learned a lot about choral and vocal pedagogy? You know, music directors are, in many senses, music educators working with amateur voices a lot of times. And what were some of the best experiences you had in your education and prior experience just in learning those things that help you speak to people who, you know, are amateur singers and to do their best musically and technically?
Yeah, well, I remember I one of my mentors at one point saying, he said, think about the things that help you become a better musician and try and think about how you can translate that to someone who knows nothing about music or maybe has only a little bit of training. And that was really informative to me, especially with working with volunteer singers, because I didn't have when I had my first church job as a junior in college. So I don't know, I was 20, 21. I really had certainly no experience teaching anything vocal, but not a whole lot of experience with any vocal formation myself. And so I found that I became a better singer the more I had to teach other people how to sing, because then I
Yeah.
kind of figured it out myself. Like, oh, okay, this works, that doesn't work, whatever it might be, and then trying to translate that to them, because singing especially is there's a lot of self-discovery with it. Oftentimes with vocal instruction, you see that there's sort of this, do what I do and you'll sound like me, but it doesn't, everyone kind of finds their voice in a different way.
Hmm.
And just teaching like that isn't necessarily helpful, especially to people who don't know what you mean when you say, lift the soft palate, or things like that. and and I found that was really helpful for me, because I too didn't really have a lot of formation in that area, and so through teaching I was able to grow myself. It was an interesting experience in that way. And then working with the repertory chorus at CUA, and working with really good singers, I do think that sometimes there's this belief that, like, working with professional choristers is somehow totally a different experience from working with kids or working with amateur choristers, and there are elements of that that are true. But then one of the things that Tim McDonald, who I studied with there, would often point out was that if you focus on what these professional singers do to produce produce a good sound themselves, but also to produce a good choral sound, you sort of do expand your choral toolbox, and you can take a certain amount of that to your volunteer choirs, to your kids choirs. Obviously, you communicate things differently, but one of the things I found was trying to really, really focus on how those professional singers were making beautiful music, and then trying to think about how I can not expect the same level necessarily from volunteer singers, but being able to apply some of those things
Yeah.
to those volunteer settings. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.
Obviously,
Yeah. That's very
you're
helpful.
with pros, you're not usually working on teaching notes or anything like things like that. So there isn't a whole lot of application there. But in terms of vocal technique and other things, I think that there is a decent amount of crossover. And oftentimes I do think, and this is certainly true with me, I was always the lazy pianist, organist, conductor, and I'd be like, oh, I can read open score, I can sight sing all these things. I'm just going to show up to rehearsal and just kind of wing it. And then I use that approach when working with these professional singers, and I totally just got my lunch eaten because they were already prepared, and I conducted them through a piece and it sounded basically perfect. And I had not trained myself to hear not just minor things that you kind of that are easy to sort of gloss over, like, oh, this consonant didn't pop the way I wanted to or whatever. But I wasn't hearing things like I wasn't really hearing good tuning, and I wasn't really hearing balance and things, because I had always kind of been a little lazy about it, and I was always just like, well, as long as you teach your choir the notes, then you're good. And then I was in a situation where that was not the case, and I do think that happens often with pianists and organists, because we tend to be we tend to sort of see the big picture musically, sometimes more than someone who's just a singer. I don't know if you want to put this in. I'm trying to think of how to say this as nicely as I can.
No, I think you hear polyphonically especially if you're an organist,
Yeah,
but also as a keyboardist.
yeah, and it's just learning how to be that much like it's easy with sometimes to be lazy about these things and just to be like a step or two ahead of the rest of the singers, but forcing yourself to be 5 or 6 steps ahead of them, even with your volunteers, who you're doing a lot more of note teaching and vocal technique and things. It has helped me become better at working with volunteers than I was previously. So,
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit more about your current job and what were some of the things you did within the first 6 months of taking this position? And I'm sure our listeners will remember this is starting in February 2020.
yes. Well, as you said, it was a little bit unusual. It was quite different from how most people begin their positions, I have to assume. I had sort of been, as I mentioned earlier, I had been subbing here during Advent previously. And so I had already gotten to know the pastor and I had kind of gotten to know the lay of the land a little bit. But what we were able to do was sort of, as everyone was able to do, was sort of do some inward looking and seeing, okay, what are areas, now that we've got all this time to sort of slow down, what are areas in which I could improve? With that in mind, I was sort of able to come in almost with a bit of a clean slate and sort of start afresh, which I did to a certain extent. And the Basilica is kind of an interesting situation because for a very long time, up until I believe the 1960s, maybe it was Vatican II, maybe it was later, I'm not sure. There wasn't really a music program here, and it was the people who provided the choirs who provided the music was usually the choir of St. Mary's Seminary, which at one point was on Paca Street in Baltimore, just a few blocks away from here, and now of course is uptown in Roland Park. But even when the seminary moved uptown, the seminarians would often come here and sing mass for solemnities, Sundays, holy days, and things like that. And other than that, it would have been pretty much low mass most of the time. Of course, we do have a very fine organ here that was used, but as I understand it, that was sort of the circumstances. And so you have that, we didn't really have this grand tradition of church music as you have at many other Catholic churches because there just wasn't really a music program to speak of. Up until the Second Vatican Council. And
right.
then...
And you mentioned that neighboring parishes near the Basilica had really strong men and boys choir traditions, right?
Yeah, tremendous ones. So like St. Ignatius Loyola, which is the Jesuit parish just a few blocks away from here, and then St. Mary's Star of the Sea in South Baltimore, and then in Northeast Baltimore, you had a Shrine of the Little Flower, which at one point was the largest parish in the Archdiocese, I believe. And then you also had at the Co-Cathedral in the Archdiocese, which is the Cathedral of Mary Our Queen, which is in North Baltimore. Up there you had Robert Twynham, who was there for, he was there only almost 40 years, and he was a composition pupil of Olivier Messiaen and was a really tremendous organist and composer. And he had a thriving men and boys choir up there. And pretty much as soon as the cathedral opened, which was in the early 60s, when the Basilica originally was the cathedral of the Archdiocese and then became the co-cathedral in the 60s. And so it is kind of interesting that there were so many churches with strong music traditions, and the Basilica just sort of did its own thing. It didn't necessarily have what these other churches had. So fast forwarding to the 2000s, and then when I arrived, the position had often been a part-time position. It was often held by graduate students at Peabody who sometimes were studying orchestral conducting or voice or something. So when I arrived here, I was able to sort of start from scratch. But my boss here was very big on making sure that when we shut down, that we were using that time to take stock of our respective programs and really use the time to kind of build anew, if you will. And so I spent a lot of time sort of cleaning out my choral library, and there were many photocopies and things that I had to throw away, and hymnals that looked like they hadn't been opened since JP2 was elected Pope. And so doing a lot of cleaning up in that area, but also thinking about what the music program could look like moving forward. One thing that I was charged with as soon as I got here was trying to find a really sturdy hymnal that we could, and a really good hymnal and one that was constructed sturdily that we could keep in the pews, because up until that point we had they'd just been using missalettes. And the pastor really wanted to make sure we got a real hymnal, a hard copy hymnal that we could keep in the pews indefinitely. And so that was one of the first things that I did was getting in touch with, we now have the St. Michael hymnal. And so reaching out to them, and that was kind of part of, there had been some liturgical changes that our rector here had tried to make, and hadn't really always gone off too well. And so he wanted to start incorporating more chant and incorporating more Latin, of course. And so I was charged with, one, trying to figure out the hymnal situation, but also trying to figure out how we could explain our new liturgical direction to people in the pews without and trying to make it as understandable as possible. And so I was writing lots of bulletin columns. I still do that occasionally, just kind of explaining, here's why we're doing chant. And then later on explaining, here's why we'll be doing polyphonic mass parts. Here's why we'll be getting rid of the processional hymn or whatever it might be.
So could you fast forward a little bit now and tell us a little bit about the current state of your program and what things look like? And also, what are some things that you hope to work towards in the next maybe 2 to 3 years?
So when I arrived, there was one choir, and it was mixed professional and volunteer. It was mostly professional. There were maybe just a handful of volunteers who participated. They kind of just threw everything together on Sundays, so there was no weekday rehearsal. And so now what I changed things up a bit. And the premier choir of the Basilica is the Schola Cantorum, which is an all-professional group. Right now it is a 6-voice group, and they sing all Sundays and solemnities and other special occasions. But then I also have 2 volunteer groups. One is a volunteer women's schola and then a men's schola as well. And they both rehearse on Tuesday nights, and they sing for first Saturday. We have a first Saturday Mass here that the women sing for the Immaculate Heart, and then we have a first Wednesday Mass for St. Joseph that the men sing for. And another thing about the Basilica is that we have a really strong young professional, young adult community, and so the members of these groups are mostly from that community. And that was I did that just to kind of keep the volunteer thing going, but also recognizing the difficulties of being, a downtown urban parish. A lot of our families come from far away, and so they can't really commit to coming in every week for rehearsal and then also singing on Sundays. And so this is kind of it's a low level commitment, but they're able to, I think, put things together really nicely for these, singular liturgies each month. So as I said, a lot of the program is structured around the Schola Cantorum, the professional group, and so looking ahead, we're hoping one of the things we've been doing is occasionally been doing choral vespers, solemn vespers, and we're looking to start doing that more regularly, hopefully once a month, and then also down the line beginning a Basilica choir school, and hopefully drawing on some families from the parish, but also on kids from various parts of Baltimore, particularly East and West Baltimore. Those tend to be the more, depressed areas of the city is a word for it. And that's one thing I'm hoping to draw upon my experience at the Newark Boys Chorus School to form. But that, of course, is a little ways down the road here.
What advice might you give to a parish music director or a pastor who is like you are, an urban parish with not a lot of families? And so, they're building maybe a program or would like to build a program that relies on professional singers like you are doing, just in terms of financing that. I mean, it's a real challenge. I know you've got a particular circumstance where you are being such a historic place in the history of American Catholicism. But what might you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways in which urban parishes are particularly advantaged, and it's not that suburban and rural parishes can't do this, but one of the things that our rector here is really focused on is trying to make the space as open as possible throughout the week. So the Basilica itself is open 12 hours a day, and then we have a perpetual Eucharistic Adoration Chapel that is, of course, open 24/7.
Wow.
Yeah, and Father hears confessions 4 days a week as well, and so I think that's a big thing. Of course, that's not necessarily a musical thing, but just making it so that people can get into the church very often and having these sacraments and other things available. One of my mentors once was fond of saying that if it's easier to get to McDonald's down the street than it is to get into the church, then you've got a problem on your hands. And I'm inclined to agree. And that's another thing that we're thinking about with our first Wednesday and first Saturday masses, but also with Vespers, and hopefully getting to the point where we're able to do that more regularly, is just having it be something where people can walk by and sort of wander in. And obviously, there are other parishes that have already kind of succeeded on doing this on the grand scale. Of course, I'm thinking of some Anglican parishes such as St. Thomas Fifth Avenue and the Washington National Cathedral that, of course, do this on a regular basis. But I just think it's possible in all urban churches. As you said, we are uniquely positioned as America's first cathedral we have donors all over the country who are able to give very generously so that we can continue building our music program, but also for things like the Perpetual Adoration Chapel, for things like our Source of All Hope ministry, which is street missionaries who live here in the city just a block away, and it's meant for young adults to give up a year of their lives to minister to the homeless and the addicted. We also have the Poor Sisters of Jesus, which is a Brazilian order of nuns who are coming to live here at the Basilica, who will be doing much the same thing, and their ministry is to the homeless and the addicted, but also they make a point of ministering to women who are working as prostitutes, and also to people who are in prison.
So would you say that really focusing on that mission of openness and availability to a downtown community is translating into support for the program?
Yes, absolutely. I would say that attitude and other things that we're doing in the parish are definitely helping with support for the music program. And there also is just one of the things that we're big on here at the Basilica is when we raise money, we're very specific about the amount that we're looking to raise, and then we're very clear about what it's going to be going towards. And so we don't just do, here's our annual capital campaign. We do kind of a few times throughout the year, we say, okay, we're trying to raise, like last year, the big one was we're trying to raise money for round-the-clock security for the Adoration Chapel, which was in the neighborhood of $100,000. And so we were very specific as to reaching out about that. And so with music, it's very much like that too. It's like, here's how much it costs to do Vespers. Here's how much it costs to fund a singer for the whole year. Or whatever it might be, being very specific about those costs and being clear that this is important for the liturgical and musical life of our parish. Too, I think is it's very important to be clear about that, because if you're kind of vague and just saying, well, give us money and we're going to do this, rather than being very very specific, I think that could be an issue. But we try to be as clear about that as possible.
Yeah. What advice might you give on discerning if a particular job or community or pastor is a good fit for you as a musician? And if you find a place that seems like a good fit, what would you advise about getting off on the right foot with your new pastor and maybe the community and really getting involved and invested in parish life?
I do think that everyone sort of has their maybe like their desires. I want to be in. Maybe I want to be in a more urban parish. Maybe I want to be in a more suburban parish. Maybe I want to be in a more liturgically traditional one. I think that that's important. For me personally, I've always really just wanted to be in an urban parish. The Basilica is in a neighborhood that is not the friendliest, but it's also not a very bad neighborhood. But that being said, it is. I've always been attracted to churches that have this kind of central location, or maybe are in a developing neighborhood of some kind. Of course. I'm always thinking of places like St. John Cantius, which of course was in a neighborhood that was struggling, and then the Cantians moved in, and of course the rest is history. So I think that is something someone can consider when going down this road. I do think too, one of the things that I've sort of learned, maybe you could relate to this as well, that sometimes. Like for me personally, I of course am very attracted to the Latin Mass, and I sort of always thought that that would be kind of the first thing that I would look for is, so okay, I want to go to a Latin Mass parish, or I want to go to a parish that is starting a Latin Mass or already has one, and maybe is still a diocesan parish that does a lot of the Novus Ordo. And while of course if we started doing the TLM here at the Basilica, I would be happy as a clam. But I did sort of realize that that's sometimes you can very easily be happy at a parish that doesn't necessarily swing your way liturgically, but still is just like a positive environment to be in, whether that's one that they're very attracted to music, or that's one that's just in an area that you particularly like. And then in terms of getting off of the right foot with your new pastor, I think one thing that's really important is just kind of learning about communication style. I was very accustomed to having bosses that sort of wanted to, sit down and kind of generally discuss things and sort of hash things out. And the rector here is, he comes from the finance world before he was a priest, and he is very much, he doesn't like meetings, and he's very direct, which I appreciate very much. I'm used to the opposite. And so I figured out, okay, he likes things in writing, and he likes sort of business plan style things. And so that's how I started, rather than going to him and being like, hey, Father, I'm kind of thinking this kind of, I would have something formulated already, and I would write it down and hand it to him and say, this is what I'm thinking in terms of developing our volunteer choir program. This is what I'm thinking in terms of buying a hymnal. This is what I'm thinking in terms of like our next liturgical thing that we can do. And rather than kind of just having a fireside chat about it, could be very clear about it, and then we go from there. So I think that's important. And I do think that in my experience so far, my limited experience, that it's good to be flexible about those things, because everyone has a different communication style. And I think it is especially with I'm not exactly the most flexible human being, and so I sort of easily get set in my ways, and I had to learn to be flexible in this area and learn to work with someone else's communication style.
Right. And you mentioned this process that you were going through just to figure out what to put in the pews. And what advice might you give on approaching the existing materials in the pews for a new music director? How does a newbie work with what he's got and move towards new resources if they're needed?
I really do think that a lot of that depends on the situation that you walk into. I was very fortunate in that I came in, and that one of the first things the rector said to me was like, I hate these things, I want to get rid of them. And so I had an advantage. I think it does get trickier if you are filling in for someone who got a hymnal that isn't great, and maybe they spent a chunk of change on it a year before, and they're still nice, they're in good condition and everything, and people tend to like them. In that case, it's going to be harder to change things around if it's a hymnal that you don't like. So I was very fortunate in that area. Another thing too with what we do at the Basilica is when I arrived, we had those missalettes, and so the expectation was that in addition to having all the hymns in one place, that we would also have all the readings for the lectionary in one place as well. And of course, when we got rid of the missalettes, when we just had the hymnals, we didn't have those readings anymore. And so now I for each mass, I make a worship leaflet, and I print however many copy of those to accommodate everyone who might be attending. And those have all the readings and all the texts that the schola sings or that the cantor sings, depending on which mass it is. So, and I kind of knew when we went in the direction of getting the St. Michael hymnal that because it was just a hymnal and not a missal, that I would need to compensate in this other area, or else I would get complaints. Right. And especially in the Basilica too, where our acoustic is so vast that depending on where you're sitting in the building, it's very difficult to understand what's being said up at the lectern. Yeah. And so having something with the readings written down is very handy. Yeah. But then I do think finding a hymnal that one of the good things about the St. Michael hymnal is that it has a lot of hymns in there. The harmonizations are very solid for the most part. They tend to be kind of the standard harmonizations. We both know the hymnals that just kind of went out on a limb and decided to reinvent, the harmonization for Hiferdal and things that no one asked for. But also recognizing that, and this is the same thing for priests too. You can't necessarily come in like a bull in a china shop and just say, okay, we're going to throw these out and we're going to bring in the Vatican II hymnal or something like that. Like you have to move much more slowly than that. And so finding something that's, if you're trying to move things in a more traditional direction, finding something that maybe is more middle of the road, or that kind of suits the congregation in general is crucial.
Right. One of the things that I've admired just in watching this process as you've started working at the Basilica is that you and your wife and your young family have really found a place in the parish and invested, a lot of your family life at the parish as well. And that's so admirable to me. And I think that's a great asset to the parish, and just also makes for a much happier situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We live very close. We live just a few blocks from the Basilica, and we're able to come to daily mass here to take advantage of confession. We also have several other parishes that are very close to the Basilica that we avail ourselves of. But it has been a beautiful experience, and it's something I suppose people differ on this, and people have different priorities. For me, it's always been a dream of mine to live close to where I work, and it's not something that, and you and I have talked about this, it's not something that really bothers us to live very close to the office, and some people don't want that, but I do think that especially with the life of the church musician is already you're already working long hours. You're there on weekends, of course. When you take days off, it's kind of at a strange point in the week, often. And so
that
I
often
think
gets overrun with meetings. And
exactly.
that's a good point for pastors to remember, that church musicians need days off too.
Exactly. And so just making it so that my family can easily come visit me at lunch, or I can go home easily for lunch, or that they can come here for mass on Sundays, and it's not that I work an hour away and they have to pile in a car, and it's just easier for them to go to the local parish or whatever. It is really amazing to experience that, and it's also great because as you know, my wife is a social butterfly, and so I can kind of just sit back and let her do all the socializing when I'm just the arm candy.
So to wrap up, what encouragement might you give to someone who feels discouraged or overwhelmed in a new position?
Well, I think that when we start these new jobs, we're obviously very excited, and maybe we've hit it off really well with the pastor or whatever, and then of course there are always going to be bumps in the road, and maybe there are difficult people in the parish or what have you. And I do think that there's always just a period of time where you're getting your footing, and it's just, no matter how experienced you are, or no matter how good of a fit the job is for you, it's going to be a little rough for a little bit. And I mean, I think that this applies to every field, but definitely especially in this field of church music. And I do think that obviously, if a place is a bad fit, or if it just doesn't work for you in some way, then maybe the best course of action is to leave. But I do think that it is important to kind of see through those first months and years until you get your footing, recognizing that it's always going to be difficult, and I think sometimes that what has been easy for me to forget is that there are people who have been at any parish. There are always these people who have been there for 50 years or something, and it might not, here at the Basilica, I was fortunate that there were those people who had been here for a very long time, and most of them were very supportive of having me on. But I've been at places where that was not the case, and recognizing that a lot of people have spent their whole lives at a particular parish, and that it just always change is always going to be difficult. And it's hard too with priest terms being kind of short, and there always being a lot of transition there. People just don't necessarily take it well.
Yeah, a sort of long view of things, if it is a good fit, and just to find ways to bring those people who have outlasted every music director and every pastor on board.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm happy to have had you on today.
Likewise. Thanks a lot, Jenny.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.